Clive Leatherdale's Dracula, the novel and the legend. A study of Bram Stoker's Gothic masterpiece. The origins of Dracula. Having some time at my disposal when in London, I had visited the British Museum and made a search among the books and maps in the library regarding Transylvania. It had struck me that some foreknowledge of the country could hardly fail to have some importance in dealing with a noble of that country. I find that the district he named is in the extreme east of the country, just on the borders of 3 states, Transylvania, Moldavia, and Bukovina, in the midst of the Carpathian Mountains, one of the wildest and least known portions of Europe. Jonathan Harker's Journal, Dracula 1:9-10. In view of the paucity of detailed information that exists concerning Bram Stoker's life, a satisfactory account of how and why Dracula came to be written is still lacking. Some of the more speculative literary and psychological influences on the author will be postponed for discussion in later chapters. Here we will be concerned with surveying the more direct contributory factors, his background, acquaintances, and known researchers. Of course, Stoker had the entire Gallic tradition of folklore to call upon, for Ireland is one of the most superstition-ridden lands in Europe. Its geographical position on the western extremity of the continent has given it a unique heritage. Because Ireland escaped conquest by the Romans, the classical imprint so evident in the mythology found elsewhere in Europe is absent. Yet, like the ripple effect on a pond, those continental myths that did filter through to Ireland continued to circulate long after the disappearance from their points of origin. These European influences both merged with and existed independently of the indigenous Irish folk tradition and the consequent richness and diversity of modern Gallic superstition has acted as inspiration to many Irish authors. In Stoker's case, he had availed himself of the fund of folk tales collected by Sir William and Lady Wilde, both of whom published major anthologies on Irish folklore. Above all, his mother had provided an early and possibly determining stimulus to Stoker's fiction, and her graphic written description of the 1832 Sligo cholera epidemic, highlighting cases of premature burial and deadly suspicion of strangers, had directly inspired one of his fairy tales. The Invisible Giant from Under the Sunset told of a young girl who sees in the sky beyond the city a vast shadowy form with its arms raised. It was shrouded in a great misty robe that covered it, fading away into air so that she could only see the face and the grim spectral hands. The face was that of a strong man, pitiless yet without malice, and the eyes were blind. A second tale from the collection can likewise be seen to anticipate Dracula. The Castle of the Kings relates a young poet's quest to find his beloved, who has apparently died in a strange castle. This quest is obstructed by various horrors until the hero finally arrives at the castle, huge, dead, and shrouded in mist. Although from a Protestant family himself, Stoker's homeland was, of course, overwhelmingly Catholic, and it is a feature of Catholic lands across Europe that they are more likely to sustain belief in vampires than are Protestant regions. The vampire is almost as entrenched in the folklore of Ireland as it is in that of the continent, though divested of most of its usual macabre manifestations. The Dergdu, the red bloodsucker of ancient Ireland, was reputed to use her beauty to tempt passing men and then suck their blood. Similarly, the Leenhornshee, the fairy mistress, was supposedly an eye-catching fairy whose charms were irresistible to men. Energy would be drawn from the ensnared male until he eventually wasted away, or else procured an alternative victim to take his place. In general, Irish fairies were presumed to be bloodless, and their abduction of humans was assumed to be designed to remedy that deficiency. It is possible to discern other non-vampire elements from Irish folk superstitions in Dracula. The devil, for instance, to whom the Count is related, is traditionally in Irish lore depicted in human guise, as opposed to the grotesque animalistic representations found elsewhere in Europe, or the spirit form familiar to the East. The devil in Irish tradition is also able to adopt feminine form and assume the role of temptress, but despite his awesome powers, he can nevertheless be outwitted. Children would often be stolen by the Irish spirit world, with changelings, deformed or senile fairies, left disguised in their place. Changelings, as with vampires, are said to be vulnerable to fire or water. Any children who had not been baptized ran an increased risk of abduction by the spirit world. Certain Irish fairies are gregarious. Others are solitary beings, for instance the leprechaun and the cluricane. The latter feared for its cunning and reputed ability to escape if discovered by becoming invisible. The Dullahan is variously conceived of as a headless ghost at the reins of a death coach which appears at midnight, or, alternatively, a black coach drawn by headless horses, but whichever guise it takes, the Dullahan portends death. The bittersweet tingling music of seduction, with which Stoker arms his vampire ladies, might have been suggested by the banshee, the indecipherable yet distinctly female wailing which signals an impending death. Stoker's vampires are also capable of transformation into phosphorescent specks, like the other Irish omens of death, the water sheeries. The souls of those who have been refused permission to enter either heaven or hell. They frequent churchyards, can appear if they choose as dancing flames, and can be repelled with a crucifix. Evil spirits are thought to be capable of being confined in or passing through narrow interstices, and certain plants or herbs, notably the rowan mountain ash, are widely held to offer protection to the bearer against the fairy world. One specific instance of Irish lore, discernible in Dracula, concerns the climax to the novel. The Count is destroyed on the 6th of November. In Ireland, the feast of St. Martin is celebrated on the 11th of that month, and it is the custom for blood to be shed either on St. Martin's Eve or earlier, during the 9-day interval following Halloween. If St. Martin fails to receive his blood sacrifice in that time span, the neglectful family can expect ill luck in the year ahead. Dracula's destruction, occurring when it does, thereby fulfills the hunter's obligation to St. Martin. As well as his Irish heritage, Stoker was well versed in Gothic romantic literature. Among the myths which can be recognized in the character of Dracula are those of Faust and the wandering Jew, who insulted Christ while making his way to Calvary, and who was condemned to wander the earth until Christ's second coming. Stoker's compatriot, Charles Maturin, had utilized this myth in Melmoth the Wanderer in 1820. Melmoth was condemned to everlasting life for signing a pact with the devil which had granted him eternal youth. Dracula, however, not only could not die, he would not die. In this, he resembles Faust, and overall, Dracula provides a curious blend of these two myths together with those of the Flying Dutchman and the Demon Lover. The literary precursors of Dracula have already been discussed, but it can be seen that Stoker was also aware of and drew upon the works of contemporary writers. Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in 1886 reworked the doppelganger motif with considerable dexterity, and Stoker would also utilize the split personality theme. Stevenson, like Stoker, wrapped his weird tale in late Victorian Britain and wove detective work throughout the narrative. Again, it is notable that Dr. Jekyll did not want to be evil. He could not help himself, a feature observable in Count Dracula. 5 years later, Stoker's fellow Dubliner and former suitor of Florence, Oscar Wilde, wrote the picture of Dorian Gray, 1891, in which Dorian, like Jekyll, leads a double life, one respectable, the other soaked in sin. The core of Dorian Gray is the search for immortality. The hero does not age. Instead, his portrait is left to bear the deterioration resulting from his sinful existence, a theme mirrored in Dracula's progression towards youthfulness. Dorian becomes entranced by the notion of blood sacrifice. He preys on the energies of the innocent, and ultimately stabs the artist in the neck and the painting through the heart in order to gain release from his torment. Critics have read into Dorian just about every favourite Victorian myth, including Faust, Mephistopheles, and Narcissus, and a biographer of Wilde has observed that Dorian is from one of the sources of the Dracula myth. Yet it is necessary to return to an earlier work for the most profound literary influence upon Dracula. One of the 19th century's most popular novels, Wilkie Collins' The Woman in White in 1860, can be seen imprinted on Dracula at 2 levels. The most obvious is the similar epistolary style. Collins had noticed how, during a court trial, each witness contributed a separate piece of information in a succession of evidence. Each testimony might vary considerably, yet still be directed towards a common cause. Most important of all, interest was maintained in the public by this constant switching of point of focus. Collins adapted this courtroom experience to his novel. The omnipresent first or third person narrator was dispensed with and subtitled by multiplicity of perspective. Stoker made use of the same device in Dracula, relating the tale through a compendium of diary entries, letters, ship's logs, newspaper reports, and spoken testimony recorded onto a phonograph. This technique permitted greater authenticity. An isolated individual's account of vampires might be dismissed as hallucinatory, but not the accounts of the entire cast, proffered independently. Collins' influence, however, goes beyond that of narrative structure. There are also long similarities in the storyline and the dramatis personae. The principal villain of each work is a count, Fosco in one, Dracula in the other. Both are endowed with personal magnetism and telepathic powers, rendering their victims' reactions ambivalent. Both share an affinity with the animal world, and both are introduced to the reader solely through the impressions given by the mainstream characters. Furthermore, both novels see a young hero embarking on a wild adventure, climaxed by a child becoming a heir apparent to the collected piles of written evidence. As for particular scenes, graveyards, insane asylums, dreary mansions, old chapels, zoological gardens, spectral trysts, and moonlight nocturnes feature in both novels. While Stoker adapts to his own purposes, Collins' scene in which children are attracted to a beautiful lady in a cemetery. Relevant works of non-fiction also came to Stoker's notice. In 1890, there appeared Sir George Fraser's The Golden Bough, an encyclopedic excursion through the taboos and superstitions of man, including a detailed account of the vampire myth. The real world, too, could not escape reports of the vampire attack.